Good morning and welcome to another Micrographics webinar. My name is Carl van Rooyen. I'll be your host for today. Today we are going to be covering rendering within Fusion 360. We'll have a look at the rendering environment and what you can do from within the rendering environment and why you would want to use the rendering environment. This live stream is being recorded, so it will be available on YouTube once it is completed. So if there is anything that you would like to review, you're welcome to go back, have a look at it, review it, and make any notes as required on what we go through. Feel free to send messages in the chat as well. I'll monitor the chat, ask any questions. If you have any questions, I'll try and answer them as best I can. And yeah, we'll get going. Let's have a look at the agenda for today. So on our agenda, we'll start with a basic intro. Why would we be looking at rendering within Fusion? What are the possible scenarios that would require renders? Then we'll move on to having a look at how to set up a model for rendering. What are some of the tips and tricks that you need to consider, or some of the things that you should consider when setting up a model for rendering? Some tips and tricks for that as well. Then we'll be looking specifically at decals and textures to be able to add some detail to your model, to the surfaces of your model. We'll move on to the render setup. Within the rendering environment, how do we set up the actual render before we then move on to the rendering method, where we will have a look at how we can render the image out. Then we'll close off with summary and Q&A. So for our introduction, we're going to look at a couple of things. And one of the sort of biggest questions is, well, why would we need to render? And a lot of, let's say, engineering companies may require renderings or may not require renderings, or think they don't require renderings. So kind of want to change a little bit of thinking there. And you could look at creating renders for design presentations. If you're busy designing up a machine that you're going to supply to a client, the client might want to know what that machine is going to look like. So you could just do a screenshot from the CAD model, but if you spend a little bit of extra time on doing a render, that image quality will look a lot better. It's a bit more professional. You could use that rendering in something like an engineering sign-off. The customer would be able to see and get a better look and feel for their product, especially if the customer is concerned about color codes. I've dealt with companies before where any machinery that goes into their plant has to have very specific color codes. And we'll see inside of the rendering environment, we can choose according to an RAL color library. So we would then be able to pick or spec the specific colors required. And rendering out will then give you a better look and feel with those colors. So renderings are useful for design presentations, and specifically what we're looking at here is rendering still images. So we'd create a nice still image, as we can see here on the right hand side of my presentation, a little CNC router with the pedestal, with the computer, the controller, and various components. So we can create those nice high quality images for engineering sign-off, add that little bit of a wow factor to it during the presentation. It can also be used for new product introduction. So you might be designing a new machine, a new product that you want to bring to market, and you want to introduce it to the big shots in the company, the marketing team, sales, business owners that might need to invest into it. And you don't have the physical item to photograph and put in. So you can create renderings of the CAD model to be able to put into that new product introduction, documentation, or presentations. And we typically find this a lot with, let's say, consumer-facing products. You generate these CAD models or concepts for consumer-facing models, and you want to be able to show off different color schemes, or you want to show off different options. In this example here with the bike, there might be different colors that the bike can be purchased in, maybe different exhaust packages or accessory packages. You want to be able to, ahead of production, create photorealistic images of those different packages that the bike is available in. And this extends onto marketing material as well. It could be quite expensive to get a photographer to take photos of all of your physical items to be able to include them on the website or in catalogs, potentially even sales presentations, to be able to have a good environment to take those photos in. Maybe you need a studio, you've got to hire the studio space. If you've got the CAD models, you can render out good quality images of the product and place them up onto your website or in your catalog, so that you don't have, or it could potentially be cheaper to do it that way rather than having all the physical objects and needing to take photos of them, especially if the product doesn't exist, if it's a concept and it's something that will only be in production in the future. Rendering helps you create a much more realistic view of the product. So from an introduction perspective, wherever you need a good quality image of your product, I've even seen some customers render out a front view of their machine, and they've taken that rendering and they've included that or integrated that into their HMI screens on the machines. So when the operator goes into the software on the HMI and they go into, let's say, machine options, it shows up a render of the machine so they can see specifically, maybe there's some options that point to a certain area of the machine and they want to set up some settings. So even on the HMI user interface on the machine, renderings can be used as well. Gives the operator a better understanding of what they're doing, what their settings they're changing on the machine, and where that is affecting the machine specifically. So from an introduction perspective, pretty much anywhere where you can think of using a good high quality image of your product. Just another example here, and sort of an example of what is possible. Just done a whiskey glass with some engraving in it, and we've got the clear glass material with a clear liquid inside of it, and we can actually see that the rendering engine takes into consideration refraction, reflection, a lot of information that's gone into that render. In this case, rendering out, got the little frosted logo on the glass there to add a bit more detail. So let's have a look at the first steps, the modeling setup. Now, typically when you're an engineer working on the design, you're worrying about the functionality and you're busy getting your design correct and ready for manufacture. And in that process, to get a complete bill of materials, you are typically going to include as much as possible. And part of that design process is going to be applying materials, so that you have the materials properties tracked per component. You know, your aluminiums, your steels, your plastics, you've got all of that tracked. And that typically automatically adds an appearance, but sometimes the appearance might not match what's required. So on this bike here, we've got rims that might be steel rims, but they're painted blue, maybe powder coated in a blue. We've got some yellowish gold components here that might be aluminium, but that are powder coated in blue, or electroplated in blue, whatever, in the yellow. So we've got these components with the various colors and appearances applied to them. So as part of the design process, you can be applying those appearances, which will go a long way in, making it more realistic. You can actually see the different colors, the different color combinations that are applied. But for a render to be a lot more realistic, you would want to add as much information as possible. Some companies might skip out on some details because it's not worth spending the time to put them into the CAD. So if we look at the CAD of the bike, and in a demo later on, I will go and deep dive into the bike here and have a look at some of the detail. But there's things like the cables for the brake lines. You could potentially add things like a keychain or zip ties, Cable ties. Information like that on the model that makes it look more realistic for the rendered goes a long way to, create a more realistic rendering. Something we'll look at as well, this is kind of twofold, is to use a fitting rendering environment. We see the bike here in this environment in the background where we say, okay, yes, that's where a dirt bike belongs. But that environment can be created in two ways. We'll look in the modeling center how to create an actual CAD model for the environment. I've got an example with the whiskey glass on a desk and where the desk is actually modeled in, versus using a HDR environment that is essentially a dome with the photos stitched on the inside of it to give us, as we see on the right hand side here, the environment that the motorbike is sitting in. So we'll have a look at that, setting up a fitting environment for the object that you're rendering. If you're doing a big machine that's going to be in a warehouse, maybe you find an HDR background or environment that is a warehouse. And so it's much more relatable for the client to see, okay, here's the machine in a warehouse. Then a bit of a tip and a trick is to use configurations and named views to assist in the rendering process. So you may have different color configurations, like once again with this motorbike, there may be different options. We've got blue and gold at the moment. Maybe there's a black and red or a red and white, blue and white. And so configurations allows you to easily change between those different setups, those different configurations, and not have to go back into the modeling environment or go into the browser and set visibility on and off for different items. Maybe your machine comes with different packages, different levels of trim. Once again, just back to the motorbike, you could have different levels of trim on the motorbike, different packages, different exhaust, different seat, and so the configurations helps with that. And then named views helps you just get back to that same camera angle. So you might go model and you move the view around and you want to get back to that view that you thought was a really good angle. Named views allows you to get back to that. And then lastly, a little bit of a modeling, I want to say glitch, but it's a bit of a modeling nuance that comes up when working with transparent materials where faces of the materials overlap. And the glass with liquid in, or a bottle with liquid in, is a good example. What happens is where you have two bodies that have faces that are coplanar, essentially they are occupying the same space, we end up getting this banding in the model. So you can see on the left hand side there, the glass on the left, we have this vertical banding around the cylindrical face where the liquid and the glass are interfacing. Now, it's not limited to, let's say, liquid and glass, or a bottle of water where you've got the water and the plastic. It could be a window, a sight glass, anything where you've got a transparent material that is coplanar or coincident with another material. And because it's transparent, you can see through, and you can see this issue that we get from the way that the surfaces are generated. And the way around this is to add a very small air gap between those objects. So if you have a window and a window frame, don't have the glass of the window right up against the window frame. You can add a small gap. In this model, I think I've got a 0.1 millimeter gap between the glass and the liquid. And you can see on the model on the right hand side, when that is rendered, we don't see that banding in the model, and it still looks as if that liquid is filling that glass completely because the gap is small enough not to see it. So we'll have a look at that in the demo, a couple of those steps that we'll go through to add that realism. And this would be in the modeling side. We're going to look at specifically when you're in the design environment, what we can do to assist in the creating a more realistic model. Then if we go into the rendering environment, we will have a look at decals and texture map controls. So decals is something that can go a very long way in making the model look more realistic. And that's the aim. We want to try and make this thing as realistic as possible. What we can see here on the dirt bike is we've got company logos, we've got numbers, typical thing that you would see on a dirt bike, the model number. We've got that KXZ 450 model number on the bike. But if you're doing industrial machinery, you can add, once again, company logos, model numbers, but also warning labels. You can position the warning labels where you need them. I've got a client that does bulk liquid tank containers or containerized bulk shipping tanks for liquids, and they've got to have a lot of warning labels, a lot of company logos, chemical signage to let the shippers know what chemicals are stored within the container, and they've got a lot of instructional signage on the container. And for them, the warning labels and being able to put these decals on is very important. And especially when producing or presenting to their client, the client needs to be able to see all of that information and know where everything is. So being able to add those decals is a very important step. And on another side of it, you can add dirt to show that it's been used, signs of use, make it that extra level of realism. We can actually see that the mud guard on the front fender, and some of the engine cover has a bit of mud splatter on it on the bike. So we can actually see, okay, cool, this is a product that's meant to be used. And we can see there that there's the dirt and the mud on that. So if you've got somebody who's really good with Photoshop, they can kind of mess around with that, create decals that you can apply onto the models. Then we get to texture map control. This forms part of the appearance that you assign. So when you assign something like carbon fiber to a component, we can see here on the bike we have the carbon fiber on the side panel and the carbon fiber covers on the shocks. That carbon fiber has a specific texture and direction to it, and we can then adjust the direction of the carbon fiber weave. So we might want to have it currently like it is at a 45, maybe we want that weave vertical on the component. And so you can adjust the direction of the texture. We'll see in examples later on with wood grain as well. You can adjust the direction of the wood grain within the component so that it fits more realistically to how the component might be cut out of a piece of wood. So with that being said, we're going to jump into the demo. And for that demo, we're going to go over to Fusion 360, and we're going to start on the dirt bike. So with the dirt bike, one of the sort of first things we'll talk about is the materials and appearances. So we can go into the dirt bike and we can see that we've got the various different components in the browser on the left, and we can grab a component, let's say from the fairings, and we've got the little piece of carbon fiber fairing here. And if we look at appearances for this, we've got all the different appearances that have been applied to the model. And so we can just use the shortcut A, but we can go right click on any of the models in the browser, and we've got the ability to go to physical materials and appearance libraries. And so with the physical materials, we can go through and we can choose a material to apply to an object. So let me go back here to the fairing. I'm going to go here, physical materials, and we'll be able to grab a physical material and drag it and drop it. There's a lot of different steels here, but we can go through the list and find something. So if I remember correctly, we'll go under try to find where the carbon fiber was, but we would be able to go through and choose the different options. So let me go back to so I seem to have lost the carbon fiber option here, but we'd be able to go and grab something. So let's say plastic, ABS plastic, and we can drag and drop the material onto a component, and that would assign that material to that component, but that assigns the default color. We can then, if we needed to go to the appearance library, I'm just pushing A for the shortcut for that, and we would then get various appearances. Once again, we've got the library at the bottom that we can go through. So here we can go other, there's the carbon fiber there, and we have a carbon fiber material. So maybe this cushion here, I want to give it a carbon fiber look. We can go, we can drag and drop that carbon fiber look over that material. Now for each of these appearances, we will see, let's say with plastic, we have just a default ABS white. And if we want to have a different color, we can apply that to the object. And then in this design section, we can go to that ABS white, we can right click and edit. And there's quite a lot we can edit here. One of the things that I mentioned up front was the fact that companies might want specific RAL colors. So we do have the color library here. And in the color library, we can go through, in this case, we've got various Pantones. So you may need to just map your RAL color to a Pantone or find the Pantone color that they need. And so we can go to a specific Pantone color and choose from that. I'm just going to search for blue here, seeing that the rest is blue. And we can see a couple of different Pantone colors. So I'm going to grab this one, Pantone 18422. And we now applied that Pantone color to the ABS. Let me go back and edit that. We can change the name. We can put in the blue or the Pantone color there so we know what it is. But we have various other options. We won't have time now to go through them, but we have some options like roughness, reflection. We can go into advanced, and we have a myriad of options in the advanced menu as well. So you can even go deeper into the materials and the appearances and edit the appearances that are being applied. So you've got a lot of freedom there with that. You can then take that appearance and you can add it to favorites. So you've got it for another model later on. Maybe it's a company color. So you've got that saved and you can reapply that as you're doing more and more designs. So I'm going to go and grab, that's aluminium glossy. I think that's what was on there. And so we can just drag and drop appearances as required. Then if we have a look at this from a realism perspective, the way the model has been created, we can actually see that we've had bands modeled with gaps underneath to kind of show sort of a retro style seat where we've got the leather bands across there. We've got the various hardware on the handlebars and the cables all the way down to the brakes. So it just adds that extra level of realism. We've got the knobblies on the tires. They're not just smooth tires. We've got all of that detail. I see one thing that is missing is the chain. That would just go a little bit further to make it more realistic if we had the chain in there. So adding as much detail as possible will fool the brain into thinking it is a lot more realistic. I'm going to come back to the glass that I did as well. In the case of this glass, let me go back to the modeling environment or design. We've created the glass with all of the rounded edges. We've got the fillets in there. We've got the liquid, even going as far as to adding the meniscus where the liquid wants to climb the wall of the glass. So in the render, we can actually see that. And what I want to show you here is in the design where we have the liquid going all the way up to the internal wall. We'll see the break here between the liquid and that glass wall. If we render this, we will see almost immediately when we hit the in-canvas render, just to get a preview, we can see some banding around where those materials overlap. So if I let this render out for a while, we would see it more pronounced, but we can already start to see that vertical banding around the model. So that one little tip there, I'll go back to the correct one here, is just to add a small gap. So I've got that little gap there between the models, and that is 0.1 millimeters. And if we go into the rendering environment here and do a quick in-canvas render here, we will see that it is much smoother around the outside. We don't have that banding in the model. And just to talk a little bit more about the model itself, as I mentioned here, we've separated out some faces. So this is using a sketch and the split tool to split some faces to create the company logo here. and the appearance has been applied to that. So a frosted glass appearance has been applied to those faces to get that frosting look. You can actually open up a rendered image here, and we can see what that looks like rendered out with the frosting and how the light is reflected through the liquid. Now, if we look at this in the rendering environment, we've got this glass just kind of hanging in a gray background. So if I look at this and I think, okay, well, the glass might not be plain, I need something else in the background, but maybe I can't find a rendering environment that looks good enough. What you can do is you can go in and you can design your own environment. So what I've done here is a table with a walnut appearance applied to it, and I've split the inside out inside there to create a leather insert, and I've applied a leather material to that with a bit of a grain texture on both. And so here now we can go into the rendering environment and we can render that and get a much more realistic view of those objects. And so from there, sort of the next thing that we spoke about was looking at configurations within the modeling environment. So if I was a manufacturer of whiskey tumblers, then I may have different configurations. Here we have the plain glass, and we could switch to a sort of diamond pattern. So I'm going to go over here to the large diamond pattern. This may take some time to calculate out because it's a sweep with quite a complex pattern, and this will bring in the other configuration. So when we're rendering, we could switch between configurations and render those different configurations. You can see there it's computing the sweep and the mirror and then the pattern. And we'll see the screen update. And our models are struggling a little bit here with all the other files open. Okay, so there we go. There we see sort of the pattern included there, and we could then create a render of that. So configurations does allow you to quite quickly and easily switch between options. Just another example that I've modeled up here is this apple, and on the left hand side I've got 4 different configurations. This could be an art project and you want to look at different color schemes. So each configuration here has a different color scheme applied where the wood materials have been painted and finished. So we can see the various different options available, quite like this natural option here with the dark wood base. So you can go through, you can choose a color option and you can render that out. So that's where the configurations helps. Now from this perspective, from here, you may want to then look at the texture mapping and decals on a model. So when it comes to decals, I'm going to quickly jump back to the glasses here. You can see that I've done the frosted decal or logo using modeling to split the face for this MGFX logo here. But on the second glass, go to the rendering environment, what I'd like to do is actually bring in an image, and I'm going to go to a named view here for the render and get a nice angle on that, and I'm going to go ahead here and add a decal. So within the rendering environment, when you change over to that rendering workspace, you do have the ability to go into appearances and adjust appearances as needed. I'm going to skip over scenes for now, but I'm going to go to decals. And selecting decal will open up your insert dialog box where you can then choose a image to insert. Alternatively, you can go insert from our computer and select a decal that you have stored somewhere on your computer. You might have a marketing drive where you have your marketing logos. I actually have one here that I'm going to grab and choose insert, and you then select the face that you want to apply the decal to. So I'm going to grab the cylindrical surface here, and this decal actually needs to be rotated. So you do get rotation and translation options. You've got a handle on the decal itself, If the decal comes in upside down or mirrored, you do have controls to be able to control that. And one thing I did notice with this is because we have these rounded edges, the face chain option here for this example actually pushes the decal around onto the inside of the glass as well. So I'm going to switch that off, and I then have the decal just applied to the outside of this glass. We can then position it, scale it if required, and all of these controls that are here on the screen are also available in the dialog box on the right hand side. So you can adjust as needed. I'm going to go back to the render view here and position that decal so that it is visible for the render view. And click OK, and that decal is then added to the model. You can double click on it, so you can select it, right click and edit, and you are able to adjust the decal as needed. So from a decal perspective, it's quite simple to add a decal to the model to be able to add that extra information. If I go over to the bike here, we'll see on the bike we've got these dirt decals that are showing. So what I'm going to do here is grab that fairing. I'm going to go down here to the front fairing, and we can see that we've got two decals applied to that. So we can actually select the decal, edit decal, and we can see here I can actually rotate that decal, and the way the decal's been designed is that there's more dirt underneath the fairing than there is on top, which would make sense. But we can rotate that, we can adjust the position of that as needed. And the same would apply for the numbers, the Autodesk logos, any other logo that needs to go on to that. We can even see on the tires, we've got some dirt there. On the suspension, we've got some dirt decals on there as well. Okay, then lastly, from an appearance side of things, we can go over to the apple here that I created, and we can see that this apple is made of wood, so it's carved out of wood, and the wood has a grain. And so if you are doing sort of art projects, or you're doing wooden objects, maybe you're a woodworker and you want to be able to render out a coffee table, a dining room chair, a dining room table, and show the grain direction of the wood, you are able to adjust that in the rendering environment. And this goes for any texture, any appearance that has a texture to it, not just wood. I just found that wood is a nice one to display because it's got so much detail. It could be carbon fiber, it could be cloth, it could be denim, leather. But what you would do is you go to texture map controls, and under texture map controls, you can select the object that you want to manage. So let's say the apple itself here. Maybe I don't like the orientation of the rings, can't maybe carve the wood like that. We can then adjust the orientation of that texture, so we can turn it sideways and rather have the rings run through the apple horizontally. We could then also rotate that. And so there are various different options on how you can adjust the orientation of the texture. So we've got those transforms that allow you to adjust orientation and position. It'll look quite nice like that. And you can also adjust the axis that this is aligned with. Now, typically there's a best fit option, so we can click best fit. That takes it back to actually the original, but you can choose a specific axis through the model, and it will rotate the texture through that axis. Now, for the wood texture, we have just this 3D texture option, but for other textures that can be applied, or other appearances that can be applied, we would have different projection types available to us. So if I had to go and add in a cloth texture, so I'm going to drag some fabric onto this, we can see that the fabric wraps perfectly around the apple. And if we go into the texture map controls, we'll see that we have various options now for this specific texture. So things like the wood texture or the 3D textures, we only have the one option, but other textures may have different options. And essentially what we're doing is we're taking that cloth, and if we choose planar, it's being put onto a planar surface and projected down onto the object. So we can actually see here, if you look at it from the top, with that axis that I chose, we're projecting that texture down onto the surface, and you can see how it distorts as it goes around to the vertical sides. And once again, we can adjust orientation of that projection. So there are various options there. We can go with box, so that is projected from all four sides. And essentially what you're trying to do here is you're trying to find a projection type that better suits the shape that you're projecting to, so that your texture that you have applied looks better on your object. Maybe with this apple, doing a spherical option works, because we can see it's sort of working from the center outwards, and it looks good around the outside of the model. And lastly, the display mode, we can actually set this up as a UV diagnostic texture, which shows us the directions of the texture. So we can actually see a spherical is pretty good. We've got the X and the Y directions, or the UV directions, quite nicely aligned. If we go with box, we can see that we've got quite a few different directions where the textures are intersecting at not the best of angles. I do like the automatic option though. It kind of finds the best option out of them. And if we go to appearance, looks the best on the appearance. Okay, so that is the texture map control. It does give you more control over how the texture is applied to the model. And as I said, not only for wood, for cloth, for leather, for tread plate, if you have appearances that are obviously more engineering type. We've got asphalt here, sand, plastic. If we go to metal, we've got all the various different metals, and we can go, let's say, to aluminium. We might have, we've got aluminium brushed to linear, so maybe we want to have that brushed direction set up correctly on the model. We even have knurled or aluminium diamond plate. I think that would look quite interesting applied to this model. So let me go and do that as one more. And we can see the diamond plate applied to that model. And we could then quite easily go to the texture map control, and we can grab that object and we can choose a different application or different projection type for that. If we go spherical, you can see how it all kind of disappears into the center at the top. So yeah, the texture map control giving you extra control over the texture on the object. Just going to go ahead and change this. Oh, that's not changed my natural. We go and add that wood back to that. There we go. Okay, so that's it for the demos on the appearances and textures and setting up the model. What we're going to do now is we're going to move back to the presentation and we look at the rendering setup. So once you have the model ready, you've applied all the correct modeling techniques, you've added any extra information you'd like to include in the 3D model, appearances, textures, decals, we then need to set up for rendering. So we've got the scene settings, which allows us to set things like the environment that the part is in. We can load sort of an HDR image that adjusts the lighting that we have. So we can have we set the environment library. We can set the position of that environment, so how the part sits relative to the environment, and that will affect the lighting. Some environments have, like we see on the right hand side, your cool light. There's big light boxes. Those would be light sources shining onto the object. And so by adjusting position, we can adjust where the shadow is. We can change things like the background color, brightness of the environment, as well as the exposure on the camera, focal length for the camera. We can even set depth of field and adjust how much blur we get with that depth of field. So we can actually focus in on a certain area and kind of have the rest out of focus. So a lot of sort of camera settings that we can work with. So We'll have a look at the render setup in a demo. We'll go through a couple of the options and have a look also at the environment library as well. Once you've set up the environment, it then is time to look at rendering. And so we'll look at the separate render methods as well. And essentially what we do is we choose our settings. So we can set the image size, the aspect ratio, we can set exposure. We've got two options for exposure. And then we can choose whether we want to render in the cloud. So we use the cloud renderer. What this allows you to do is it allows you to offload your calculations to a cloud server. That server will then render out the image and notify you when the image is ready. This allows you to free up your own PC to continue with any other work. Maybe you continue modeling, or you want to set up other renders that you want to render out. The downside to this, there's the pros of offloading that work, but the downside is it does cost tokens. Now, depending where you are in the world, tokens may be easy to come by. Here in South Africa, we can't currently purchase tokens, and cloud credits have been discontinued. So even from a reseller side, we're still trying to kind of figure out, okay, what's the best way going forwards? But yeah, contact your closest reseller, request or ask about tokens for Fusion. Are they available in your geographical area? Can you use them? Unfortunately, I don't have any tokens. I didn't have any tokens at time of recording, so I had to do all of my renderings with the local renderer. So the local renderer uses your CPU, uses your computer to render. It doesn't cost anything. The cost is essentially the slowdown in the time it takes to actually do anything while your computer's rendering. So when I was doing this this presentation, preparing for this webinar, I was doing the renders in the background in Fusion, and then working on the PowerPoint, working on other models, having a look at other things, and it slowed the PC down. The CPU is working hard to create the renders. But at the end of the day, you get that render out, you can still then, you can use it either way, whether you use cloud render or local render, they render to the same quality. It'll just affect, let's say, the time that it takes to do the render and whether or not you can continue with other work or not. So we've got those two different render options. So I'm going to jump into a demo now, and we're going to go back to Fusion. Let's have a look. I'm just going to keep let's go to the dirt bike, because we can use the dirt bike quite nicely for the environments in the background. So if I go to the render workspace with this dirt bike, currently we have just a gray blank background, and we have a bit of a shadow on the ground there. If we turn the model, we can kind of see the light source is coming from this side and it's casting the shadow. So this side of the bike is quite dark. If we wanted to render this side of the bike and have it lighter, we would need to go into scene settings. And inside of our scene settings, we've got two different tabs. We've got the settings tab for setting up our bulk of the information, but then we have the environment tab. And I'm going to go here first, and you'll see that there are a default set of environments. Currently I've got photo booth active. I can double click on field to load field, and that will load the field environment. And I can kind of turn this around, zoom in and out, and you can see that the bark is somewhat disconnected from the field. We can make it a little miniature RC bark, or we can make it a full-sized bark. But the image itself in the background is quite a nice, crisp, clean image. And you can see reflections in the shiny parts of the bark. It's reflecting that environment in the bark, so it grounds it in the environment. Yeah, we kind of got to get the scale correct. And what we can do is we can go back to settings, and we can use the position option to now adjust the rotation of the environment. And you'll see that that's going to move the bark around in the environment. Maybe we want to see town in the background, the hillsides, or we want the bark potentially on the road. So this one here is going to be a bit difficult with the current settings to get the bark traveling along the road, but we do have options to flatten the ground. And what this does is it basically puts the bike down on the ground and grounds it with the environment. And so now when we rotate, we get a little bit more control. The only downside to this is you can see the environment in the background is now a little bit distorted. But if we look, let's say, along this direction, or even back this way, it's not too bad. So we could do a render, let's say something like this, to see that bike on a dirt road in the environment that it should be in. We can change the camera. Typically we would go perspective. It's a more realistic view. We have that perspective shift of the part. You can adjust focal length, which will adjust sort of that perspective look. And we also have exposure. Right at the top I did miss the brightness. We can slide the brightness slider to bring up the brightness, but the exposure as well, much like on a camera where you can adjust the exposure, that is also going to help with that brightness. The exposure in most cases will lighten up some of the dark areas within the model. You can apply depth of field if you need to. So I'm going to switch on depth of field and choose a center of focus. So maybe here on the front fairing, that's going to be our center of focus, and anything else may be blurred out, and you can adjust the level of blur. You can save this as default and you can then continue on. So here I would close and would then render. Now as far as rendering goes, we can either render in canvas. So if I hit play here, this is kind of like a preview. This will now render this out on screen so you can see if you need to make any tweaks. I like to do this before doing a sort of final render, just as a draft to see what it looks like. Now this is CPU based, so if you have a nice fast multi-core CPU, it's going to be a lot cleaner, a lot quicker, as it cleans up the noise in the model. And we can see it slowly cleaning up the noise, and we kind of get reflections on the different areas. And if we're not happy at this point, let's say maybe it's too dark or too bright, we can stop the render and we can go and change the scene as needed. If we want to take a draft screenshot, we can use the capture image option. That will capture the current image that you have on screen to the current document size. So it's much like taking a screenshot. We can see the pixel width and height, and when you hit OK, it's just going to ask you to save it to a certain location. So I'm going to save that literally to just to my hard drive, and I can use that in a presentation, put it into a PowerPoint, or email it off and say, here's a first draft, tell me if you're happy with the composition of the render. And it continues to render out, and you do have a slider here. You can have it stop at what they term excellent, you can go to final, or you can say infinite. Sometimes I actually do the infinite. I'll leave work and I'll come back in the morning and it'll have run for 8 hours overnight, and the quality will be really good. The only problem with this is because it's in window, you're only going to get a very limited pixel size on that image. So you do need to be aware of that. I'm going to stop this one. Some of the images that I've rendered out are then rendered using the render option, where, as I mentioned, you can choose to either use the cloud renderer, and you can choose a quality as standard or final. And depending on your options that you choose, you can see various options: web, mobile, print, video. Those will give you the different resolutions. So we can go, 1280 by 1024. If we go to print, we can go all the way up to 8.4 megapixels. So 300, that's at 8.5 by 11 inch by 300 pixels per inch. We can even go video quality here as well, specific video resolutions. Or you can go custom, and you can set up a custom width and height size that you want. Once you've done that, you've chosen your size, your aspect ratio, your exposure, you can then go choose cloud render. That would require, in this case, if I push up the quality, that requires 2 tokens. I can then render if I had the tokens. Otherwise, we can go local render, and under advanced settings, you've got options to go draft, standard, final, or excellent. And that will then render out until a certain number of passes have been done on the image itself. And you then get a image returned back to you. So in this case here, if I cancel this window, sorry, my Fusion seems to be misbehaving here. To have a cancel option, let me just hit render. Okay, so that's going to send that one off. It's a low quality render, so it doesn't cost anything. It's going to send that render off to the cloud, and we'll see in the bottom here, we will get a render added in to the gallery. So we can see there that render's been submitted, or is busy being submitted. Okay, while that submits, I'm going to go ahead back to the presentation for our summary. So basically in summary, the rendering environment in Fusion, the rendering workspace in Fusion, is a quick and easy way to create good quality images for your products. And there's not too many settings to have to deal with compared to other packages that I've worked with. To be honest, you know, I kind of have always worked with Inventor, and I find Fusion 360's environment is a lot simpler to render in. There's a lot less settings that you need to worry about, and you can get some pretty good quality renders out quite quickly from Fusion. And it's a simple interface to work with. Some of the colors in Fusion are also emissive. So if you are looking at having little LED lights or screens within your design, for the color itself that you apply, that appearance, you can actually say it's emissive, it's giving off light. So you can get a glow of light around that component. So it's a quick, simple, easy interface to be able to create quality renders. And you can seamlessly transition between the model workspace to the render workspace, make changes. You can go back to modeling, go back to rendering. And so it's quite a seamless transition back and forth. There's no exporting and importing to get into a render environment. And then lastly, it's used for outputting images for various tasks, you know, for review, if you're going to do a review with the client or with marketing, or you need images for marketing your product, put on your website, put it in print, whatever it might be. The rendering environment is a good outlet for that. And then once again, you have the option, you can do the cloud rendering, offload that work to Autodesk's cloud servers. They do all the calculation. You reap the benefits of that. Or you can do local render. If you don't have the tokens to be able to do that, you can still render locally on your own PC, but it uses the resources of that PC. And with that, we'll close off the presentation with some Q&A. I'm just going to go back into Fusion while we wait to see if any questions come through. And we can see here previous render that I was done. We can open up that render, we can preview it, and we can then have a look at options that we have here as well. We can download or we can delete this render. Just out of interest's sake, I've got a couple of renders that were done, some basic ones and some more complex ones as well. Let's have a look here. Got the dirt bike rendered out with its background. And just maybe one last thing to mention, these HDR backgrounds, I think I actually forgot to mention this. So while we wait for any questions to come through, I just want to go back to this quickly. Under scene settings, if you go to environment library, you can choose existing environments, but they are limited. And right at the bottom, you have replace custom environment option here. And if you click on that, it will allow you to choose an HDR image to place in. Now you can do that from your cloud, from your data panel, so essentially within the project, or you can select from our computer. And I've got a couple of HDRI backgrounds here. I'll show you the websites now that I got those from as well. I'm going to grab the path one here, click open, and that will then load that custom HDR image in, and you can then adjust and position as required. So we've got another sort of custom image that is used for that background environment. These images, there are a couple of websites that do supply them free of charge, a couple of samples, and if you want any others, then you can purchase those HDRs. So that specific one with the path, that one down here, that was from hdrihub.com. These websites all look very similar, but they do have some separate content. We've got Polyhaven. You can see all the different options available here as well, and in various formats or quality as well. And then HDRI Haven here as well. So we've got Polyhaven and then HDRI Haven. Like I said, these three sites are very similar, but there is different content on each of the sites. And you can basically download your HDRIs here and place your project within that HDRI. Okay, I haven't seen any questions come through in the chat, so I'm going to sign off. Thank you very much for your attendance. This once again has been a Autodesk webinar brought to you by Micrographics. If you enjoyed the webinar or you're enjoying the content, please feel free to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Micrographics. Don't forget to click for notifications to be notified of when our next webinar is. We have various technicians putting out webinars on various topics, anything from mechanical engineering through to architecture, AEC, build environment, manufacturing. We've got various webinar topics that are lined up for the coming months, and there will be more going forwards as well. We also have quite a vast library of previous webinars as well, and some shorter tips and tricks type videos or how-to videos. So please feel free to go check out our YouTube page, our YouTube channel, and then our website as well. Once again, thank you very much, and